Please be seated. When I first started as a lawyer, part of my job was in night court in the Bronx. And now, yes, I don't know if any of you remember that comedy show from the 1980s, Night Court. Well, it was just like that, but without the romantic comedy, and I hated it. The fluorescent lights were lurid and grim, and the hallways were grimy and dirty, and nobody wanted to be there, not the judges, not the court personnel. Everyone just wanted to dispose of the cases and go home. So this passage that we read, that we heard tonight, just now, is basically night court in first century Jerusalem. It's true. Basically, Pilate is the judge, and he's been sitting there all night with a parade of undesirables, misdemeanor and felony cases, and in comes this one more Jewish insurrectionist, and he's got to deal with it. Now, as you know, in this season after Pentecost, we have been walking with Jesus on this road from Galilee to Jerusalem. Jesus is on a mission of proclamation and healing, and there have been many teaching moments along the way. And it all ends in utter disaster. It all ends in utter failure. Basically, his own people, the Jewish authorities, and one of his best friends turn him in to the hated Romans, and he is basically charged on trumped-up charges of sedition, which is a serious crime. It's words or deeds to incite insurrection or rebellion against the governing authority, the Romans. And so he's in night court. And so this scene that you get is the first snippet of a courtroom scene. And so basically, if I were to put my lawyer hat on, I would go through each of these questions, and you would see that Jesus doesn't answer anything that Pilate asks him. And so if I were there as the lawyer, I would say, "Objection, Your Honor, non-responsive." So let's take a look at this question and answer scene in the courtroom between Pilate and Jesus. So what is the first question that Pilate asks? Yeah, because if Jesus says yes, it's open and shut. It's a closed case. He's basically admitting, yeah, I am the king, basically in conflict with the governing authority. But Jesus is too smart for that. So he basically responds with a question by asking another question, basically who told you? So non-responsive. So what's the second question that Pilate asks him? Yeah, what have you done? Let's get to the facts, right? So nothing conclusory, just what exactly have you done? And how does Jesus answer that question? He doesn't, right? He gives this metaphysical speculation, right? My kingdom is not from this world. Like, what the heck kind of answer is that? Pilate now is totally exasperated, and/or he's got a gotcha question for his last question. What is it? So you are a king, leading question, but Jesus, of course, doesn't take the bait. And what does Jesus say? You say that I'm it. Yes, you say it, I'm not saying it, and I've come to testify to the truth. Both a profoundly simple and profoundly mystical statement on Jesus' part there. So anyway, that's the first of the scene, and Pilate's got nothing on him. He can't convict him. But because of the pressure from the Jewish authorities and the crowd, you guys know the rest of the story. Jesus ends up sentenced as a criminal for sedition and literally nailed for that crime with nailed above his head, right, the sentence, I-N-R-I, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That was the seditious statement for which Jesus was executed. So that's how this mission of proclamation and healing ends. So what kind of kingship is that? Now, if you look at or listen to all of the prior readings that we had today, we first had the reading from Daniel, and then we read the Psalm, and then we heard from the book of Revelation. That's the kind of traditional kingship that we're comfortable with, right? That's, kings talking about dominion and power and majesty and might, right? Power and judgment. But Jesus' kingship, to the extent that we can call it kingship, is all about vulnerability. And it ends, of course, as we just said, with crucifixion. And I want to read from one of my favorite theologians. No, it's not Richard Rohr. This is Fleming Rutledge. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she's an Episcopal priest and an incredible preacher. And she says this about crucifixion and the incredible countercultural proclamation of our faith. So listen to this. For Jews and Gentiles alike in those days, a crucified person was as low and despised as it was possible to be. Crucifixion sent an unmistakable signal. This person that you see before you is not fit to live, not even human. As the Romans put it, such a person was damnatio ad bestiale, meaning condemned to the death of a beast. Although in our society it would be considered unacceptable to kill even an animal in such a way. There was nothing religious, nothing uplifting or inspiring about the crucifixion. On the contrary, it was deliberately intended to be obscene in the original sense of that word. The Oxford English Dictionary suggests disgusting, repulsive, filthy, foul, abominable, loathsome. It is therefore of the utmost importance to note that in an era when crucifixion was still going on and was widely practiced throughout the Roman Empire, Christians were proclaiming a degraded, condemned, crucified person as the Son of God and Savior of the world. By any ordinary standard, and especially by religious standards, this was simply unthinkable. So what Jesus does, what this whole feast is about, is this, once again, topsy-turvy, upside-down, Alice in Wonderland world that God is breaking into our world. And he says, it's not about power, folks. It's actually about vulnerability. The reason why Jesus is our King is because he is vulnerable enough to offer himself out of love for the healing of the world. Because it is only vulnerable love that heals. So our kingship is about vulnerability. St. Paul says the same thing over and over and over again in his letters. My favorite is when he's talking in 2 Corinthians, he's deliberating about this issue that he has, and he refers to it as his thorn. We don't know what it might be. Some scholars think maybe it's his sexuality. Other scholars think it's just his sense of being an outsider and not good enough and just ashamed. But he comes to this realization and he says, my grace, meaning God's grace, is sufficient because my power, God's power, is perfected in weakness. Power is perfected in weakness and vulnerability. How's that for an upside-down, topsy-turvy, Alice in Wonderland God that we have? So Jesus, Paul, and others talk about the power of vulnerability. I don't know if any of you have heard of Brene Brown. Does that name ring a bell? Well, anyway, she is one of the foremost social workers. Denise, you might have heard of Brene Brown or might like to listen to her. Actually, I recommend it for everybody. Go on Netflix. Brene Brown, she has a book called The Power of Vulnerability. And basically she says that vulnerability is the key. If you want deeper intimacy in your relationships, if you want more joy and happiness, the way is not to self-protect, but to be vulnerable. So she would be sort of like the modern-day spokesperson of this concept that Jesus and Paul are talking about. They're talking about vulnerability. Now, of course, what does Richard Rohr say about vulnerability and this aspect of our Christian faith? He says this: we live in a finite world where everything is dying, shedding its strength. This is hard to accept, and all our lives we look for exceptions to it. We look for something certain, strong, undying, and infinite. Religion tells us that the something for which we search is God. But many of us envision God as strong, complete, and all-powerful, a God removed from suffering. In Jesus, God comes along to show us, even I suffer. Even I participate in the finiteness of this world. After 2,000 years, Jesus is still a revolutionary symbol, revelation, and reality. He turned theology upside down and taught, in effect, God is not who you think God is. The enfleshment and suffering of Jesus reveals that God is not apart from the trials of humanity. God is not aloof. God is not a spectator. God is not merely tolerating human suffering or instantly just healing it. God is participating with us in it, living it alongside us and with us. Through encountering the living God in our pain, we can experience another kind of life, another kind of freedom. So Jesus is showing us another way to God and to living meaningfully and authentically in this life. It's not about power, not about domination, it's about vulnerability. Yesterday, or on Friday, I was going through the office with Tammy. We were, getting rid of old stuff. And I stumbled across this book. And it's called Simple Ways to Pray for Healing. And at first I thought, this would be great to, give to one of those little free libraries or whatever. And then I flipped through it and I came to Healing Our Image of God. And I stopped and I said, I need to hear that. I really need to hear that. Because I have been really struggling since my father's death from COVID last year with enormous amounts of guilt and shame and regret. And it has to do with regret for the conflict that I had with my father. He died suddenly, so there was no opportunity to heal that. It has everything to do with the fact that, we'll never know how my dad got COVID, if I was the one that unknowingly brought COVID into the household. So just enormous amounts of shame and regret and guilt. And I realized to myself, this is because somewhere deep back in my psyche, in my head, after all the years of study and theology and prayer and preaching about God is love, there's still a little place that fears that God is judgmental and that God is out to punish me. And if God's not going to punish me, maybe I should punish me. And so I read this and read the first chapter, and this is what it says. Healing our image of God. We have found that prayer and healing are possible only to the extent that we have a positive, loving image of God. Few of us will open ourselves or become vulnerable to a God of whom we are terrified. Yet many of us carry deep fear of God because we have been taught to see God as punitive. The ultimate image of this is a judgmental God who keeps a list of our mistakes and may vengefully throw us into hell if the list gets long enough. Moreover, we become like the God we adore. If our God has the same unloving attitudes we are trying to heal in ourselves, we are not likely to get very far. So healing our image of God is what this Feast of Christ the King is all about. It's not a buzzkill right before Thanksgiving and the holidays. It basically says, yes, our God is almighty, but what's important is that our God is all vulnerable. In the name of God, Father, Son,